Fear in these circumstances, in my view, is a deadly poison. If you get scared and back down, as some suggest, recommending compromise, this compromise, in my opinion, has no end. And so if you ask me what our biggest challenge is now, it's the challenge of standing firm. This standing firm is the responsibility of both the armed forces and the government and its capabilities. It's the capability of those who must ensure the country's economic strength and the people's livelihood. It's also up to diplomacy to keep the flag of the Islamic Republic flying high across the globe.
Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi hosted a meeting with senior army commanders at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs on Monday, a gathering that carries as much symbolic weight as strategic substance. According to Iran's DIFA press news agency, Major General Amir Hatami, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, led a delegation that included Rear Admiral Habibullah Sayari, Deputy Coordinator of the Army, Rear Admiral Shahram Irani, Commander of the Navy, and Brigadier General Bahman Bey Mard, Commander of the Air Force. The meeting took place just days after Iran held indirect talks with the United States in Muscat, Oman, and on the eve of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Washington, where he is expected to discuss Iran with President Trump. The convergence of these events makes the timing of the commander's visit to the diplomatic headquarters difficult to read as anything other than deliberate. Major General Hatami issued a notably strong public warning, reflecting Iran's military stance in recent months. According to the Jerusalem Post, Hatami said Iran's military was closely monitoring the enemy and is prepared to respond decisively to any aggression. He added that the presence of U.S. ships in the region was nothing new, stating that they have seen this many times over the past decades. The statement can be interpreted as projecting both readiness and restraint, acknowledging the American military buildup while framing it as routine rather than exceptional. Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces Abdul Rahim Mousavi reinforced this posture. According to China Daily, Mousavi stated that Iran is not interested in a regional war, but is prepared for one if necessary. The pairing of these statements, Hatami's warning of an unprecedented response alongside Mousavi's assertion that Iran does not seek war but is prepared for one, reflects the classic deterrence formula that Tehran has employed throughout the current crisis. The message is directed simultaneously at multiple audiences. To the United States, it signals that military action will not be met with passivity. To Israel, it warns that any strike will trigger consequences beyond what either side experienced during the June war. To domestic audiences, it projects strength and readiness at a moment when the Iranian public is watching its government navigate between diplomacy and the threat of renewed conflict. And to the region's other powers, particularly the Gulf states, it signals that any war will not be contained to Iran alone. The meeting of military commanders at the Foreign Ministry sends a specific message. Iran's diplomatic track and its military posture are now openly intertwined. In previous rounds of nuclear negotiations, Tehran maintained at least a formal separation between its diplomatic and military establishments. The decision to bring the Army's top brass to the Foreign Ministry, rather than convening the meeting at a military facility, signals that Iran wants its adversaries and its own population to understand that negotiations are being conducted under the protection of military readiness, not as an alternative to it. This is consistent with the doctrine Araghchi articulated at the National Congress on Foreign Policy earlier in the week, where he described Iran as a people of diplomacy but also a people of war, a people ready for war so that no one dares to fight them. The philosophy is one of peace through strength, though applied from the Iranian side. Military preparedness is presented not as aggression, but as the precondition for meaningful diplomacy. Without the credible threat of military response, Tehran argues, the other side has no incentive to negotiate fairly. Araghchi himself made this philosophy explicit at a foreign policy conference in Tehran, where he stated that Iran is not afraid of the American military and is not deterred by its deployment in the region, according to Israel Hayom. Araghchi's public statements since the Muscat talks have been consistent in their framing. He described the talks as a good start and said a decision on further rounds would be taken after consulting with the capitals, according to CNN and Al Jazeera. But he also emphasized that there is very, very deep distrust after what happened during the previous talks, referring to the June 2025 war in which the United States struck Iran's nuclear facilities while indirect negotiations were ongoing. That experience, in which diplomacy and military strikes occurred simultaneously, has fundamentally shaped Tehran's approach to the current round. Iran is willing to talk, but it does not believe that talking provides protection against attack. The June 2025 experience is central to understanding Tehran's current posture. In the months before the 12-day war, Iran was engaged in indirect talks with the United States through Omani mediation, the same format being used now. On the night of June 22nd, while those talks were still nominally active, US B-2 stealth bombers struck Iran's nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan in Operation Midnight Hammer. The lesson Tehran drew from that experience is unambiguous. Diplomatic engagement does not guarantee safety. It may even provide cover for military planning. This is why Araghchi has repeatedly emphasized that Iran approaches the current talks with eyes open and without trust. It is also why the meeting with army commanders at the Foreign Ministry carries such weight. It is a visual declaration that Iran will not make the same mistake of allowing diplomacy to lull it into a false sense of security. The substance of the Muscat talks reveals the structural obstacles to any agreement. Iran has insisted that the negotiations focus exclusively on the nuclear file. Araghchi stated that missiles are not on the agenda of the talks, and that Iran will never give up its right to develop and exploit peaceful nuclear energy, including uranium enrichment, according to China Daily. Zero enrichment on Iranian soil is completely off the table. These positions have been Iran's red lines for years, but they are being stated with renewed force in a post-war context where Tehran feels it has already absorbed the worst that military force can deliver and survived. The structural impasse is clear. Iran insists on negotiating nuclear issues only, with enrichment rights preserved. Netanyahu insists that any deal must include ballistic missiles and an end to support for regional groups. Trump has signaled that a nuclear-only deal would be acceptable, but his Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the talks needed to include all those issues. The gap between what Iran will discuss and what Israel and parts of the American establishment demand represents the core obstacle that no amount of diplomatic creativity has been able to bridge. Meanwhile, Iran has reached 60% enrichment, a short technical step from weapons grade, and has declared that enrichment levels will be determined by national needs alone. The American side at the Muscat talks was led by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law and Middle East advisor, but the most notable participant was Admiral Brad Cooper, commander of U.S. Central Command, the most senior American military commander in the Middle East. According to Al Jazeera, a U.S. Air Force Boeing 737 used to transport high-ranking commanders landed in Muscat on the morning of the talks. It was the first time a CENTCOM commander participated in nuclear negotiations with Iran, a decision that Tehran publicly objected to. Araghchi stated that Iran categorically opposed the presence of a military official in the negotiation process, according to Israel Hayom. He said the Americans explained that Cooper had come to visit his aircraft carrier and that his presence at a customary courtesy meeting was a separate matter, but Iran rejected that explanation. The significance of Cooper's presence extends beyond protocol. As the commander of U.S. Central Command, Cooper oversees all American military operations in the Middle East, including the forces that would execute any strike on Iran. His participation in the talks, regardless of the explanation offered, blurs the line between diplomacy and military planning in a way that Tehran finds threatening. From Iran's perspective, having the officer who would command an attack sitting at the same table where negotiations are taking place is not a confidence-building measure. It is an implicit threat. Araghchi reportedly stated at the Tehran conference that the presence of the CENTCOM commander does not change Iran's stance, despite the symbolic implications of his participation. He added, whatever his purpose in coming, he achieved it. The remark suggests Araghchi acknowledges that Cooper's presence sent a message, even as he dismisses its effect on Iran's resolve. The day after the talks, Witkoff and Kushner visited the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, deployed in the Arabian Sea near Iran's shores, together with Admiral Cooper, according to CENTCOM's own statement and reporting from Axios. The visit was described by a source familiar with the details as intended to send a message to Iran that Trump has other options if the negotiations fail. The Abraham Lincoln and its strike group would be the spearhead of any U.S. military action against Iran. The sequence of events, from the negotiating table in Muscat to the flight deck of an aircraft carrier within 24 hours, encapsulates the dual-track approach that both sides are now pursuing. For Washington, the carrier visit is part of a deliberate strategy of negotiation under military pressure. The Abraham Lincoln Strike Group, combined with other assets deployed to the region, represents the most significant American naval presence in the Persian Gulf area since the June War. Trump has spoken publicly of a tremendous force heading to the region and has used the threat of military action as leverage in the negotiations. The message to Tehran is straightforward. Make concessions at the table, or face consequences. But Iran's leadership has indicated that it interprets this pressure not as an incentive to compromise, but as confirmation that the United States negotiates in bad faith. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei added another dimension to Tehran's public messaging. According to Iranian media, Baghaei said the United States must decide whether it is capable of negotiating independently or whether it remains under what Tehran describes as Israeli influence. Our negotiating party is the United States, Baghaei stated. It is up to the U.S. to decide if it can act independently of pressures that are to the detriment of the region. He also confirmed that Iran was willing to remain at the negotiating table for consecutive days, emphasizing that the Muscat round was designed to test the seriousness of the American side. The framing positions Iran as the party willing to negotiate in good faith while questioning whether Washington is free to make its own decisions. This line of argument has deep roots in Iranian diplomatic rhetoric, but it carries particular resonance in the current context. Netanyahu's announced trip to Washington to shape the Iran negotiations reinforces Tehran's narrative that the United States cannot act independently on Iran policy. From Iran's perspective, every time Netanyahu visits Washington and the scope of negotiations shifts or military rhetoric escalates, it validates the claim that Israel exercises disproportionate influence over American foreign policy in the Middle East. Whether this characterization is accurate or oversimplified, it shapes how Tehran interprets American actions and calculates its own responses. The Netanyahu-Trump meeting adds the most volatile element to the equation. According to the Associated Press and the Washington Post, Netanyahu is heading to Washington on Tuesday to encourage Trump to expand the scope of the nuclear talks to include Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for regional militant groups. According to CNN, Netanyahu also intends to discuss possible military options against Iran and plans to present Trump with fresh intelligence on Iran's military capabilities. Israel remains skeptical that the negotiations will succeed, CNN reported, but is pressing to ensure its interests are protected and to preserve Israel's freedom of military action under any potential agreement. The meeting was originally scheduled for February 18th, but was moved up at Netanyahu's request, according to Israeli sources cited by Axios. The acceleration of the timeline is itself significant. According to NBC News reporting from December, Netanyahu had previously presented Trump with 4 scenarios for military action against Iran, an exclusively Israeli attack. An attack led by Israel with minimal U.S. support, full collaboration between the U.S. and Israel, and a U.S.-led assault. The sources suggested Netanyahu may present a similar set of options during this week's meeting. Whether the meeting produces concrete decisions or serves primarily as a consultation will depend on Trump's assessment of the diplomatic track, but Netanyahu's history suggests he will push for maintaining maximum pressure and military readiness regardless of the state of negotiations. It is worth recalling that in June 2025, it was Netanyahu who initiated the 12-day war with surprise strikes on Iran, and Trump who ultimately demanded a ceasefire after the conflict escalated beyond what either side anticipated. The dynamic between the two leaders on Iran is complex. Netanyahu pushes for aggressive action, Trump weighs the costs and benefits, and the result has historically been American military involvement that goes further than Trump initially intended. The upcoming meeting will test whether that pattern repeats or whether Trump's stated preference for a nuclear-only deal represents a genuine shift toward a more restrained approach. Trump's own signals have been mixed. He called the Muscat talks very good and said more meetings were planned, according to multiple reports. He also stated that a deal addressing only nuclear issues would be acceptable, suggesting he may not insist on the broader scope that Netanyahu is advocating. According to the Atlantic Council's Nate Swanson, the military options are also legitimately bad, and there is no clear silver bullet, a reality that constrains Trump's choices regardless of what Netanyahu recommends. The Gulf states have reportedly played a significant role in discouraging military action, with all of Iran's neighbors expressing serious concerns about the consequences of strikes, according to the Atlantic Council's analysis. The Gulf dimension is often underappreciated in Western coverage of the Iran crisis. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Oman are geographically proximate to Iran and would bear the immediate consequences of any military escalation, whether through disruption of energy exports through the Strait of Hormuz, retaliatory strikes on U.S. bases hosted on their territory, or broader regional instability that would threaten their economic development strategies. These countries have been actively mediating and counseling restraint, and their influence on Trump's calculations should not be underestimated. From Tehran's perspective, the parallel tracks are deeply troubling. Iran is engaged in diplomatic negotiations in Muscat, while simultaneously watching the United States coordinate military options with Israel and Washington. The CENTCOM commander participates in the talks and then tours the aircraft carrier that would lead any attack. Sanctions are imposed hours after the talks conclude, and Netanyahu flies to Washington to push for expanding the scope of negotiations that Iran has explicitly said will focus on nuclear issues only. This convergence of diplomatic and military activity is precisely the pattern that preceded the June 2025 war, when the United States struck Iran's nuclear facilities while indirect talks were still underway. Tehran's decision to bring its army commanders to the foreign ministry is a direct response to that experience. It reflects a leadership that has concluded it cannot afford to pursue diplomacy without simultaneously preparing for the possibility that diplomacy is being used as cover for military planning. The IRGC added its own message to the mix. On the Thursday before the Muscat talks, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps reportedly conducted a test launch of the Khorramshahr-4 ballistic missile, a weapon with a range that could reach Israel and U.S. bases across the region, according to Iranian press TV. The missile was displayed on a mobile launcher taken from an underground base. Yadola Javani, the IRGC's political deputy, stated that unveiling the missile means that although we have sat down at the negotiating table, we will not give up our military power. The timing of the test, days before the diplomatic round, was itself a form of communication. Iran wanted to ensure that its willingness to talk was not interpreted as willingness to negotiate from a position of weakness. The Khorramshahr-4 is one of Iran's most capable ballistic missiles, with a range that puts both Israel and U.S. military installations across the Gulf within reach. Its display on a mobile launcher from an underground base was designed to demonstrate both the weapon's readiness and its survivability, showing that Iran's missile force can operate from concealed positions that would be difficult to neutralize in a preemptive strike. The test launch came just one day before the Muscat talks, a sequence of events that mirrors the American approach of combining military signaling with diplomatic engagement. Both sides are playing the same game. Talk at the table, flex at the border. The week ahead will determine whether these parallel tracks converge toward escalation or stabilize into a managed competition. The Netanyahu-Trump meeting on Wednesday is the immediate flashpoint. If Trump signals receptivity to expanding military options or adopts a harder line on negotiations, Tehran may conclude that diplomacy has reached its limits. If Trump instead pushes for continued talks on the nuclear file while managing Netanyahu's expectations, the diplomatic window may remain open, but the margins are thin. Iran's commanders are preparing for what they describe as a decisive response. The United States has positioned its most powerful naval assets within striking distance, and Israel's prime minister is flying to Washington with intelligence briefings and military scenarios. When diplomacy proceeds without trust on either side and both parties are simultaneously preparing for war, the space for miscalculation narrows with every passing day. What happens in Washington this week will shape whether the Middle East edges toward another round of conflict or finds enough reason to keep talking. The fundamental asymmetry of the situation is this: Iran is negotiating because it wants sanctions relief and security guarantees. The United States is negotiating because the alternatives, another round of military strikes with uncertain results, are expensive and unpredictable. And Israel is intervening in the process because it believes any agreement that leaves Iran's enrichment capabilities and missile program intact represents an existential threat. These three sets of interests do not naturally converge. The Muscat talks, the commanders meeting at the foreign ministry, the carrier visit, the Khorramshahr-4 test, and the Netanyahu trip to Washington are all pieces of a puzzle in which every player is simultaneously trying to negotiate and prepare for the failure of negotiations. In that environment, the line between deterrence